Elon Musk walked into the courtroom that morning, his shoulders squared and his mind sharp. The room buzzed with anticipation, filled with reporters, lawyers, and a handful of curious onlookers who had managed to secure seats. This wasn't just any legal battle. It was one that had been dragging on for months, drawing attention from every corner of the globe. At the center of it all was Judge Victoria Langston, a woman whose name carried weight but also whispers. Rumors about her integrity, or lack thereof, had followed her for years, though nothing concrete had ever stuck. Until now. As Elon took his seat at the defendant's table, he glanced around the room. He noticed how some people leaned forward eagerly, while others exchanged skeptical looks. He could almost hear their thoughts. What is going to happen today? The air felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. But Elon wasn't nervous. If anything, he seemed more focused than ever. His eyes locked onto Judge Langston as she entered the room, her robe flowing behind her like a cape. She carried herself with authority, her chin held high, her expression unreadable. "Please rise," the bailiff called out in a loud voice, signaling everyone to stand as Judge Langston approached the bench. All around him, people stood up respectfully, shuffling to their feet. But Elon stayed seated. His decision wasn't impulsive, it was deliberate. As the murmurs rippled through the room, Judge Langston paused, her gaze narrowing as she spotted him still sitting. Her lips pressed together tightly, and there was a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Mr. Musk," she said sharply, her tone cutting through the noise, "is there a reason you refuse to show respect to this court?" Her voice echoed off the walls, commanding attention. Everyone turned to look at Elon, waiting for his response. For a moment there was silence, a pause so tense you could feel it in your chest. Then without hesitation, Elon spoke. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I will not stand for corruption." The words hit the room like a thunderclaw. People gasped audibly, some leaning forward in disbelief. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes, their pens flying across notebooks. Even the bailiff looked startled, glancing between Elon and the judge uncertainly. Judge Langston's face flushed red, her composure slipping for just a second. But she quickly masked it, slamming her gavel down hard enough to make the sound reverberate. "Order! Order in the court!" she barked, though her voice betrayed a hint of unease. When the room settled again, she leaned forward, her eyes drilling into Elon. "You're treading dangerous ground, Mr. Musk," she warned, her tone icy. "Are you accusing me of something?" Elon didn't blink. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed, but his expression serious. "Not yet," he replied coolly, "but I'm here to ensure that justice is served, not bought." The tension in the room skyrocketed. No one dared to breathe too loudly. It was rare to see someone challenge a judge so openly, especially someone as powerful and influential as Elon Musk. Yet here he was, unafraid to call out what he believed was wrong. Some people in the gallery exchanged glances, nodding subtly in agreement. Others looked worried, wondering where this confrontation would lead. Judge Langston tried to regain control of the situation. She adjusted her glasses and shuffled some papers on her desk, buying herself a few seconds to think. "This trial is about the charges against you, Mr. Musk," she said finally, attempting to steer the conversation back on track. Not baseless accusations or distractions, but Elon wasn't backing down. He leaned forward again, placing both hands firmly on the table in front of him. "With all due respect, Your Honor, these aren't distractions," he countered. "They're facts. And if we want real justice, we need to address them head on." For the first time in the proceedings, Judge Langston appeared rattled. She hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the bench. The courtroom hung in suspended animation, waiting to see what would happen next. Would she try to shut him down completely? Or would she let him continue, knowing full well that doing so might expose cracks in her own armor? Elon sat back, his expression calm but determined. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about exposing a deeper issue. one that affected countless lives beyond his own. As the judge opened her mouth to respond, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with uncertainty. Whatever came next, it was clear that this day would be remembered for a long time. Judge Langston's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Musk," she said, her tone firm but laced with an edge of irritation, "you seem to have forgotten where you are. This is my courtroom, and I expect respect from everyone." Her eyes locked onto him, daring him to challenge her again. But Elon didn't flinch. He sat there, his expression calm, almost too calm for someone in his position. It was as if he had already played out this scene in his mind dozens of times. "I understand that, Your Honor," Elon replied, his voice steady. "But respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. And when people see corruption staring them in the face, they stop respecting authority." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery, but most people stayed silent, their eyes darting between Elon and the judge. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a rare moment where power was being questioned openly. The judge's jaw tightened, and for a brief second it looked like she might lose her composure entirely. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, gripping the arms of it tightly. "You're walking a very thin line, Mr. Musk," she warned, her voice low but sharp. "If you continue down this path, you'll find yourself in deeper trouble than you can imagine." Elon tilted his head slightly, studying her as if trying to read her thoughts. Then he spoke again, his tone polite but unyielding. "Trouble doesn't scare me, Your Honor. What scares me is seeing justice turned into a game only the wealthy can win. That's why I'm here, to shine a light on what's been happening behind closed doors." Before Judge Langston could respond, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. The action drew everyone's attention. Reporters leaned forward, cameras clicked silently, and even the bailiff seemed curious about what Elon was holding. Without saying a word, Elon placed the folder on the table in front of him. Inside were documents, pages upon pages of evidence detailing suspicious financial transactions involving individuals closely connected to Judge Langston. Some of the names listed belonged to high-profile lawyers and business people who had appeared in her courtroom over the years. "This isn't speculation, Your Honor," Elon said, tapping the folder lightly. "These are facts, hard proof that decisions in your courtroom haven't always been impartial." His choice of words was deliberate, leaving just enough room for interpretation without crossing any legal boundaries. Still, the impact was immediate. The room erupted into whispers, and Judge Langston's face flushed red once more. "Enough," she shouted, slamming her gavel down so hard it echoed like a gunshot. "I will not tolerate these baseless accusations. In my courtroom, if you have evidence, present it properly or sit down and let us proceed with the case." Elon raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her outburst. "Baseless?" he repeated, letting the word hang there for a moment. "Let's talk about that, shall we? Because I've done my homework. For example," he opened the folder and pulled out one particular document, holding it up for everyone to see. "This transaction right here shows money moving from a company under investigation to an account linked to one of your closest associates. Care to explain how that happened?" The judge froze, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She glanced at her clerk, then at the lawyers sitting nearby, searching for support. But no one came to her rescue. Even the prosecution team shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The gallery was abuzz now, with people whispering frantically among themselves. Someone muttered, "Did he really just do that?" While another whispered, "This is insane." Judge Langston tried to regain control, her voice rising above the noise. "Mr. Musk, whatever theatrics you're attempting to pull here won't work. You're wasting everyone's time." But her words lacked conviction. There was a crack in her armor now, and everyone could see it. Elon didn't miss a beat. "Theatrics?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "No, Your Honor. This isn't theater. These are real lives we're talking about. Families, destroyed because they couldn't afford to pay off the right people. Small businesses crushed under unfair rulings. all while others walk away scot-free because they know how to play the system. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, he added softly, "That's why I'm standing my ground today. Not for me. For them." His final sentence sent a ripple through the room. People nodded quietly, some even clapping before realizing where they were and stopping themselves. One elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, clearly moved by his words. Another man in the back muttered, "Finally, someone saying what we've all been thinking." Judge Langston, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Recess," she barked, pointing her gavel at the bailiff. 10 minutes, everyone out." As the crowd began filing out of the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Reporters scrambled to get quotes from anyone willing to speak, while court staff exchanged nervous glances. Outside, the media circus grew louder, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward anyone leaving the building. Back inside, Judge Langston retreated to her chambers, slamming the door shut behind her. Through the frosted glass, shadows moved, as she paced back and forth, visibly shaken. Meanwhile, Elon remained seated, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around him. He flipped through the folder one last time, double-checking the documents. When a young intern approached him hesitantly, asking if he needed anything, he simply smiled and shook his head. "Just making sure the truth speaks for itself," he said quietly. As the recess dragged on, speculation ran wild. Would Judge Langston recuse herself from the case? Could Elon's bold move actually lead to meaningful change? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain: the courtroom would never be the same after today. When the courtroom doors reopened, the atmosphere felt different. The earlier buzz of excitement had shifted into something heavier, a mix of anticipation and unease. People filed back in quietly, their eyes darting toward Judge Langston's bench and Elon Musk's table. Reporters jostled for better positions, cameras clicking softly as they adjusted their lenses. Even the bailiff seemed more alert, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by a subtle tension. Everyone knew the recess hadn't been just a break. It was a moment for both sides to regroup, rethink strategies, and brace themselves for what might come next. Judge Langston returned to her seat with less pomp than before. Her steps were deliberate but slower, almost hesitant. She avoided looking directly at Elon as she settled into her chair, adjusting her robe carefully, as if buying herself a few extra seconds to compose herself. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "Let's proceed," she said, her tone clipped but quieter now, like someone trying too hard to sound in control. Elon watched her closely, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat or press further, not yet. Instead, he waited patiently, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. It was a calculated move, one that drew attention without saying a word. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Before we continue, I think it's important to clarify something." The judge stiffened visibly, gripping the edge of her bench. "Clarify what, Mr. Musk?" she asked, her words measured but edged with caution. She clearly wanted this conversation over, but Elon wasn't about to let her off the hook. "This trial isn't just about me," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It's about every person who walks through those doors hoping for fairness, hoping that justice means something more than who has the deepest pockets." He paused, letting his words sink in. In the gallery, people exchanged glances, some nodding slowly. A young man sitting near the front whispered to his companion, "He's right," before trailing off, realizing how quiet the room had become. Elon continued, his tone softening slightly. "I've built my life on solving problems, big ones, problems that affect millions of people. But none of that matters if the system meant to protect them is broken. If decisions are made not based on facts but on favors, then everything else falls apart." His voice carried a weight that resonated deeply, even with those skeptical of him. For a moment it felt less like a legal argument and more like a plea for accountability, for honesty, for change. Judge Langston shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the wood of the bench. "Mr. Musk," she interjected, her voice firmer now. "You're free to air your grievances, but this court has rules. Rules designed to ensure fairness for all parties involved." "Fairness?" Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. The single word hung in the air, loaded with meaning. "If fairness truly existed here, Your Honor, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We wouldn't need whistleblowers or investigations or exposés. Justice would speak for itself." He opened the folder again, pulling out another document. This time, instead of holding it up dramatically, he slid it toward the prosecution team. "Take a look at this," he said simply. "It's a record of payments made to third-party consultants linked to your office. Payments that conveniently align with rulings favoring certain defendants." The prosecutor glanced at the paper, his face pale. He hesitated, unsure whether to pass it along or keep it to himself. Judge Langston's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What is this nonsense?" she demanded, her voice rising despite her attempt to stay composed. "You're parading hearsay and innuendo as evidence?" "It's not hearsay when the numbers add up," Elon countered smoothly. "And it's not innuendo when witnesses are willing to testify under oath." With that, he turned to face the gallery. "In fact, I'd like to call my first witness now." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Witnesses? No one had expected this twist. The judge's face flushed red again, and she slammed her gavel down once more. "Order!" she barked, though her voice wavered slightly. "Who is this so-called witness, Mr. Musk? And why wasn't this disclosed earlier?" Elon smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "Because sometimes, Your Honor, the truth reveals itself when you least expect it." He gestured toward the door, and a middle-aged woman walked in, her step steady but cautious. She wore simple clothes, a plain blouse and slacks, and carried a folder similar to Elon's. As she approached the stand, the murmurs grew louder. Who was she? What did she know? The judge frowned deeply, clearly uneasy. "State your name for the record," she instructed, her tone clipped. The woman nodded, taking a deep breath. "My name is Rachel Thompson," she said, her voice clear, but tinged with nervousness. "I used to work as a clerk in this courthouse." The room fell silent. Even the reporters stopped scribbling for a moment, their pens hovering mid-air. "A former employee?" This was getting bigger by the minute. Elon stood up, addressing the witness directly. "Ms. Thompson, can you tell us about your experience working here? Specifically, any irregularities you may have noticed regarding case outcomes?" Rachel hesitated, glancing briefly at Judge Langston before speaking. "Yes," she said softly. "There were patterns. Certain cases always seemed to go one way, no matter how strong the opposing arguments were. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then I started noticing things. Late-night meetings, unusual requests, files being altered after hours." Her voice cracked and she paused, clutching the folder tightly. "I tried to ignore it. I told myself it wasn't my place to question. But when I saw innocent people lose everything because of these decisions..." Her eyes welled up with tears and she looked down, unable to finish her sentence. The gallery erupted into whispers again, louder this time. Someone muttered, "This is insane," while another whispered, "How could this happen?" The judge, meanwhile, looked like she'd been struck. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the gavel. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to do next. Elon stepped forward, his voice gentle but resolute. "Thank you, Ms. Thompson," he said, "for having the courage to speak up. Because that's what this is really about. Courage. Standing up for what's right even when it's hard." As the hearing continued, the momentum shifted entirely. What had started as a routine legal battle had morphed into something far greater, a reckoning. And Elon Musk, ever the strategist, was leading the charge, one bold move at a time. The courtroom was alive with tension, a mix of disbelief and awe rippling through the crowd. Rachel Thompson's testimony had struck a nerve, her words painting a picture that many in the room hadn't dared to imagine. The murmurs grew louder as people pieced together what they were hearing: patterns of favoritism, late-night meetings, altered files. It wasn't just about Elon Musk anymore. It was about exposing cracks in a system that had long operated in shadows. Judge Langston's face was pale, her usual composure shattered. She gripped the gavel tightly, her knuckles white, but she didn't raise it this time. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling as she addressed the witness. "Ms. Thompson," she began, her tone sharp but uneven, "are you suggesting that I, or anyone under my supervision, was involved in misconduct?" Rachel hesitated, her hands gripping the edges of the stand. She glanced at Elon briefly, then back at the judge. "I'm not suggesting anything," she replied, softly. "I'm stating facts. Facts I witnessed firsthand." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "There were times when cases were decided before they even reached the courtroom. Files disappeared or reappeared with changes no one could explain. And yes, Your Honor, there were connections between those decisions and certain individuals outside the court." The gallery erupted into whispers again, louder than before. People exchanged shocked looks, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. A man near the back muttered, "This is unbelievable," while an older woman clutched her chest, visibly shaken. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his usual stoic demeanor replaced by unease. The air felt thick, charged with emotion. Elon stood quietly, watching the scene unfold. He didn't interrupt or try to steer the conversation further. For now, he let Rachel's words do the work, but his presence loomed large, a reminder that this wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a fight for something bigger: justice, transparency, accountability. Judge Langston struggled to regain control, her voice rising above the noise. "Enough," she shouted, slamming the gavel down hard enough to make the sound echo. "This is outrageous, Ms. Thompson. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it properly or step down." Rachel straightened her posture, her nervousness giving way to determination. "I do have evidence," she said firmly, pulling out a stack of papers from her folder. Emails, financial records, internal memos, all showing irregularities tied directly to rulings in this court. She placed the documents on the stand, then turned to Elon. "Would you like me to hand these over?" Elon nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Please," he said simply. As Rachel passed the documents to him, the prosecutor team exchanged frantic glances, clearly unsure how to respond. One of them whispered to another, "This can't be happening." But it was happening. Elon took the documents and walked them over to the prosecution table, placing them squarely in front of the lead attorney. "Take your time reviewing them," he said, his tone polite but laced with steel, "because we're just getting started." The prosecutor flipped through the pages quickly, his face growing paler with each document. Finally, he looked up at Judge Langston, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor, this appears to be credible information. We may need to request a recess to investigate further." The judge's jaw tightened, her frustration evident. "Absolutely not," she snapped, though her voice lacked its earlier authority. "We are not halting proceedings because of baseless accusations." "Baseless?" Elon interjected, stepping forward. His voice carried across the room, silencing everyone instantly. "If they're so baseless, why does your clerk look like she's seen a ghost? Why is the prosecution suddenly scrambling?" He pointed toward the gallery where people sat wide-eyed, hanging on every word. "These aren't just accusations. They're truths waiting to come to light. And if you refuse to address them, then maybe it's time someone else takes over this case." The room fell silent again, the weight of Elon's words sinking in. Judge Langston stared at him, her eyes blazing, with anger but also something else, fear. For the first time, she seemed uncertain, vulnerable even. She glanced around the room, searching for allies, but found none. Even her own staff avoided her gaze, their loyalty wavering under the mounting pressure. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter but still defiant. "Mr. Musk, you've made your point, but this trial isn't about you playing detective, it's about the charges against you. Let's focus on that." Elon shook his head slowly, his expression unwavering. "No, Your Honor. This trial is about much more than me. It's about whether this court can deliver real justice or if it's just another stage for corruption to thrive." He paused, letting his words resonate. Then he added, "And if you won't acknowledge that, then perhaps it's time for higher authorities to step in." With that, he reached into his briefcase once more and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without hesitation, he handed it to the bailiff. "This contains copies of everything we've presented today, including additional findings that warrant immediate investigation. Please ensure it reaches the appropriate oversight committee." The bailiff accepted the envelope reluctantly, looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. The judge watched the exchange, her face turning redder by the second. "You're overstepping, Mr. Musk," she warned, her voice shaking slightly. "Interfering with judicial processes is a serious offense." Elon met her gaze steadily, unflinching. "So is allowing corruption to go unchecked," he replied. "Which one do you think history will remember more clearly?" The crowd stirred again, some nodding in agreement while others whispered nervously. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. Outside, the media circus intensified, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward anyone leaving the courtroom. Word of what was unfolding inside spread like wildfire, drawing attention from all corners of the globe. As the session dragged on, Judge Langston became increasingly agitated. She ordered Elon to sit down multiple times, but he ignored her, pressing forward with his arguments. Each piece of evidence he introduced added another layer to the damning narrative building against her. By the time the afternoon wore on, it was clear that the tide had turned completely. What had started as a routine legal battle had morphed into a full-blown exposé, a reckoning that no one saw coming. When the final gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, the courtroom buzzed with energy. People lingered, reluctant to leave, as if afraid they might miss something crucial. Elon packed up his documents calmly, ignoring the reporters clamoring for comments. As he walked out, flanked by security, he stopped briefly to address the crowd. "Justice isn't given, it's demanded," he said simply. Then he disappeared into his car, leaving behind a legacy not just of innovation, but of integrity for Guy. Judge Langston, however, the nightmare was only beginning. Calls for investigations flooded in and whispers of impeachment swirled in legal circles. The story dominated headlines worldwide, sparking debates about transparency and accountability in the justice system. And at the heart of it all stood Elon Musk, a man who refused to bow down no matter the cost. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. The energy was heavier, almost suffocating. Reporters had arrived earlier than usual, their cameras set up in every available corner. The gallery was packed to capacity, with people standing along, the walls just to catch a glimpse of what might happen next. Outside, news vans lined the streets, broadcasting live updates as journalists tried to piece together the fallout from the previous day's explosive revelations. It wasn't just a legal case anymore. It was a national spectacle. Judge Langston entered the room with none of her usual authority. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and lacked the confidence she'd shown at the start of the trial. She took her seat without making eye contact with anyone, her face pale and drawn. For the first time, she looked less like a judge and more like someone bracing for impact. The murmurs in the room grew louder as people noticed her demeanor. One woman whispered to her neighbor, "She looks like she didn't sleep a wink last night." Another man muttered, "Who could blame her?" Elon Musk, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He walked in calmly, his posture relaxed but alert. His team followed closely behind him, carrying stacks of folders and documents that hinted at even more evidence yet to be revealed. As he settled into his chair, he glanced briefly at Judge Langston, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the gallery, scanning the crowd with a steady gaze. When his eyes met those of Rachel Thompson, who sat quietly near the front row, he gave her a small nod, a silent gesture of gratitude and solidarity. before proceedings could begin. One of the prosecution lawyers stood up, clearing his throat nervously. "Your Honor," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we need to address the new developments brought forward yesterday, specifically the allegations regarding irregularities within this court." Judge Langston stiffened visibly, gripping the edges of her bench tightly. "Proceed," she said curtly, though her tone betrayed her unease. The prosecutor hesitated, glancing at his colleagues before continuing. "After reviewing the documents submitted by Mr. Musk and corroborating them with our own findings, we believe there is sufficient cause to request an independent investigation into these matters." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs. Even the bailiff looked startled, shifting uncomfortably as the weight of the moment sank in. An independent investigation? That was unprecedented. Judges weren't supposed to be investigated. They were meant to embody impartiality and fairness. Yet here they were, discussing the unthinkable. Elon leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. This was exactly what he had hoped for. A crack in the system wide enough to let the truth shine through. But he didn't celebrate, prematurely. Instead, he listened intently as the prosecutor continued. "We also recommend that Your Honor recuse yourself from this case immediately," the lawyer added, his voice firmer now. "Given the nature of the allegations, it would be inappropriate for you to preside over any further proceedings." Judge Langston's face flushed red, her composure shattering. "Recusal?" she repeated, her voice rising sharply. "On what grounds?" "These are baseless accusations fueled by speculation." "They're not baseless," Elon interjected, standing up smoothly. "They're supported by facts presented under oath by credible witnesses and backed by financial records. Facts that suggest a pattern of misconduct stretching back years." He paused, letting his words sink in before turning to address the gallery directly. "This isn't about revenge or personal vendettas," he said, his tone measured but passionate. "It's about ensuring that justice is blind, not bought. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to know that their fate won't be decided by bribes or favors. If we allow corruption to fester unchecked, then we lose faith in the entire system." His words resonated deeply, drawing nods of agreement from the crowd. Some people even clapped softly before remembering where they were and stopping themselves. In the front row, Rachel Thompson wiped away a tear, her expression a mix of relief and pride. She hadn't expected her testimony to spark such a massive shift, but here it was, a catalyst for change. Judge Langston, however, wasn't ready to concede defeat. She slammed her gavel down hard, silencing the room. "Enough!" she barked, her voice shaking with anger. "This court will not be turned into a circus. I refuse to step aside based on unproven claims." Elon raised an eyebrow, unfazed by her outburst. "Unproven?" he echoed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Your Honor, the proof is sitting right in front of you. If you truly believe in justice, then you'll welcome an investigation. Anything less would only confirm what we already suspect." The tension in the room reached its peak. People held their breath, waiting to see how Judge Langston would respond. Would she dig her heels in and fight back? Or would she finally admit that the game was up? For a long moment she said nothing, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she struggled to compose herself. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter but laced with bitterness. "Very well," she said, her words clipped. "I will temporarily step aside pending an inquiry. But mark my words, Mr. Musk, this isn't over." The gallery erupted into whispers again, some cheering quietly while others exchanged shocked glances. A few reporters scrambled toward the exits, eager to file their stories before competitors beat them to it. Outside, the media frenzy intensified, with anchors breaking news live on air. Headlines began popping up online almost instantly. Judge steps aside amid corruption scandal. Elon Musk shakes up justice system, and courageous witness sparks nationwide debate. As the hearing adjourned, Elon gathered his things calmly, ignoring the swarm of reporters trying to get his attention. He exchanged a few quiet words with his legal team before heading toward the door. Just as he was about to leave, Rachel Thompson approached him, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing me, for giving me the chance to speak up." Elon smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he replied. "Without your courage, none of this would have been possible." With that, he walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a scene of chaos and transformation. The battle wasn't over yet. There would still be investigations, hearings, and likely attempts to discredit what had been uncovered. But one thing was certain: the wheels of accountability had begun to turn, and Elon Musk, ever the disruptor, had ensured that no one could look away. The days following Judge Langston's temporary recusal turned into a whirlwind of activity. The courtroom drama had spilled out into the public sphere, dominating headlines and sparking heated debates across dinner tables, social media platforms, and news channels. People who had never paid much attention to the inner workings of the justice system were now glued to updates, their opinions divided but their curiosity undeniable. Was this a watershed moment for accountability? Or was it just another chapter in the endless saga of power struggles? For Elon Musk, life outside the courtroom became equally chaotic. Reporters camped outside his offices, hoping to catch even a glimpse of him. His phone buzzed nonstop with calls from journalists, supporters, and critics alike. Yet he remained unfazed by the commotion. Instead, he focused on what mattered most: ensuring that the investigation into Judge Langston's conduct would be thorough and transparent. He knew better than anyone that exposing corruption wasn't enough. Real change required action. Inside the courthouse, things moved quickly. An independent oversight committee was formed, tasked with examining the allegations against Judge Langston and her associates. Legal experts, forensic accountants, and ethics investigators descended upon the courthouse, combing through years' worth of records. Every ruling, every transaction, every decision was scrutinized under a microscope. It was painstaking work, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. If the claims held up, and early reports suggested they would, the implications could shake the entire judicial system. Meanwhile, Rachel Thompson found herself thrust into the spotlight. What had started as a quiet act of courage had transformed her into an unlikely symbol of integrity. Media outlets clamored for interviews, activists praised her bravery, and strangers reached out to thank her for speaking out. But fame wasn't something she had sought or wanted. She spent her days fielding messages, trying to stay grounded amidst the chaos. When Elon arranged for her to meet privately, she arrived looking exhausted, but resolute. "You didn't sign up for this," Elon said as they sat down together in a quiet corner of his office. His tone was gentle, almost fatherly. "I know how overwhelming it must feel." Rachel nodded, clutching a cup of tea in both hands. "It's not easy," she admitted. "People keep calling me a hero, but I don't see myself that way. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not after seeing what happened to those families, those businesses. They deserved better." Elon leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. "You're stronger than you realize," he said after a pause. "Most people wouldn't have taken the risk you did. You stood up when so many others looked away. That takes guts." She smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. "Once the investigation is over, I mean. Do you think anything will really change?" Elon hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but this is a start. Every time someone speaks up, every time we expose wrongdoing, we chip away at the walls protecting the powerful. Sure, there'll be pushback, they always try to protect their own, but we can't let them win. Not this time." His conviction seemed to reassure her, if only slightly. "I hope you're right," she murmured, "because if nothing changes, then none of this will have mattered." Back at the courthouse, Judge Langston's absence loomed large. A replacement judge had been assigned to oversee the remaining proceedings, a no-nonsense woman known for her strict adherence to ethics. Her presence signaled a turning point, a shift toward restoring faith in the system. Still, the shadow of suspicion hung heavy over the case. Lawyers whispered about potential appeals, defendants worried about retrials, and ordinary citizens wondered whether justice would ever truly prevail. As the investigation unfolded, more details began to emerge. Former clerks came forward sharing stories similar to Rachel's. Business owners recounted how they'd been pressured to pay bribes to secure favorable rulings. Even some lawyers admitted to playing along with the corrupt system, too afraid to rock the boat. Each new revelation added fuel to the fire, keeping the story alive in the public consciousness. Elon stayed involved, attending meetings with investigators and offering resources to help speed up the process. He also used his platform to amplify the voices of those affected by the scandal. Through interviews, social media posts, and public appearances, he reminded people why this fight mattered, not just for him, but for everyone who believed in fairness and equality under the law. One evening, as he prepared to leave his office, a young intern approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me, Mr. Musk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" Elon turned to face her, curious. "Of course." "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, gesturing vaguely toward the stacks of documents and news clippings scattered around the room. "You didn't have to go this far. You could have walked away." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Walking away isn't an option," he said simply. "When you see something wrong, you fix it. That's what I've always done. Whether it's building rockets, creating electric cars, or standing up to corruption, you don't wait for someone else to step in. You act." The intern nodded slowly, clearly moved by his response. "That's inspiring," she said. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It will," Elon replied firmly. "Not because of me, but because of people like Rachel. Because of witnesses willing to testify, reporters chasing the truth, and everyday citizens demanding better. Change starts with us. All of us." By the end of the week, the investigation had uncovered enough evidence to warrant formal charges against Judge Langston and several of her associates. News broke late one night, sending shockwaves through the nation. Prosecutors announced that multiple counts of bribery, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice were being filed. For many, it felt like vindication, a long overdue reckoning for those who had exploited the system for personal gain. Yet Elon didn't celebrate. As he watched the news unfold from his living room, he felt a mix of satisfaction and resolve. This victory was significant, yes, but it was only the beginning. Corruption didn't exist in isolation. It thrived where transparency faltered, where fear silenced dissent, and where greed outweighed morality. Dismantling it entirely would take years, maybe decades. But for now, he allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes standing up meant refusing to bow down, and sometimes it meant lighting a fire that could burn away the rot, one truth at a time. The weeks following the announcement of formal charges against Judge Langston marked a turning point, not just for the case, but for the nation. The scandal had grown beyond a single courtroom. It became a symbol of everything wrong with systems that prioritized power over principle. People who had once felt powerless began to speak up, emboldened by what they'd seen unfold. Stories poured in from across the country, ordinary citizens recounting their own brushes with injustice, sharing tales of bribes demanded, rulings manipulated, and lives shattered. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing years of pent-up frustration and anger. Elon Musk watched it all happen with a mix of pride and caution. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. While the investigation into Judge Langston's conduct was a victory, it also exposed deeper cracks in the foundation of the justice system. For every corrupt judge or lawyer caught, there were likely others operating in the shadows, shielded by layers of bureaucracy and fear. But Elon wasn't deterred. If anything, he saw this as an opportunity, a chance to push for reforms that could prevent such abuses from happening again. He threw himself into advocacy work, partnering with legal experts, activists, and lawmakers to draft proposals aimed at increasing transparency in courts. One idea involved creating a public database where people could track rulings, financial disclosures, and potential conflicts of interest involving judges and lawyers. Another focused on implementing stricter oversight committees to monitor judicial behavior. These weren't flashy initiatives. They didn't involve rockets or electric cars, but they mattered deeply. To Elon, fixing broken systems was just another kind of innovation. Rachel Thompson, meanwhile, continued to inspire. After stepping forward, she became a beacon of hope for others who had suffered silently. Her story resonated because it was relatable. She wasn't a billionaire or a celebrity. She was just someone who had decided enough was enough. Activist groups invited her to speak at rallies. Community leaders sought her advice, and even schools asked her to share her experience with students. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to take on such a role. But eventually, she embraced it, realizing that her voice carried weight. One evening, during a small gathering organized by a local nonprofit, Rachel stood before a crowd of about 50 people. They ranged from teenagers to retirees, united by a shared desire for change. As she spoke, her nervousness melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence. "I never thought I'd end up here," she admitted, gesturing to the room around her. "I didn't plan any of this. All I did was tell the truth, and look what happened." She paused, letting her words sink in. "It taught me something important, that speaking up matters, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared." Her speech earned a standing ovation, and afterward, dozens of attendees approached her to thank her personally. Some shared their own stories of injustice, while others simply wanted to shake her hand. By the end of the night, Rachel left feeling both exhausted and empowered. She realized that courage was contagious and that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference after all. As for Judge Langston, her fall from grace was swift and merciless. Facing mounting evidence, she resigned from her position before the trial could begin, citing health issues as her reason. But no one believed her. Rumors swirled about secret meetings, hushed negotiations, and attempts to strike deals behind closed doors. Whatever she hoped to achieve, it didn't work. The court stripped her of her title, and prosecutors vowed to hold her accountable for her actions. It was a stark reminder that no one, not even those in positions of authority, was above the law. For Elon, the case served as a lesson in resilience. There had been moments when he doubted himself, when the pressure seemed overwhelming. Yet he persevered, driven by a belief that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth it. He often reflected on how far they'd come since that first day in the courtroom, when he refused to stand for corruption. That simple act of defiance had sparked a chain reaction, leading to uncoverages, investigations, and ultimately, accountability. In the months that followed, the ripple effects of the scandal spread wider than anyone anticipated. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening ethical standards within the judiciary. Courts across the country implemented new measures to ensure fairness and transparency. Even everyday conversations changed. People talked openly about corruption, demanding better from their leaders and institutions. What had started as a personal battle for Elon had evolved into a collective movement for justice. One afternoon, as he drove home from a meeting with reform advocates, Elon found himself reflecting on the journey. He thought about Rachel, whose bravery had ignited the spark, about the countless individuals who had reached out to share their stories, hoping for change, and about the future, a future where integrity might finally outweigh greed. Pulling into his driveway, he stepped out of the car and looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a sense of accomplishment. Not because he'd won, but because he'd tried. Because he'd stood firm when others might have walked away. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. And with that, he headed inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.